This is completely unacceptable. You're fired, effective immediately. Pack your tools and get off my motor pool. The words cut through the mechanical noise of the 3-core motor pool at Fort Hood, Texas, sharp enough to make multiple soldiers and civilian mechanics stop what they were doing and turn to look. Second Lieutenant Brandon Hayes, 24 years old and 3 months into his first assignment as a maintenance platoon leader with the 1st Cavalry Division, stood with his arms crossed and an expression that mixed frustration with the particular arrogance of someone who believed their rank entitled them to make sweeping personnel decisions without full information. Before him stood an elderly civilian mechanic whose coveralls were stained with grease and hydraulic fluid, whose weathered hands held a torque wrench, and whose work pace had apparently offended the young officer's sense of efficiency and modern standards. The mechanic was Frank Martinez, 76 years old, standing at 5 feet 9 inches with the slightly stooped posture that comes from decades of bending over engine compartments and crawling under heavy vehicles. He wore standard motor pool coveralls that had been washed so many times the original dark blue had faded to almost gray, steel-toed work boots that had been resoled at least twice, and a faded ball cap with a 1st Cavalry Division patch from the 1960s that most of the young soldiers didn't recognize. His face showed deep lines carved by 7 decades of life, including 2 years in Korea as a tank driver during the final months of that war, and his hands, though showing the tremor common to advanced age, bore the scars and calluses that come from a lifetime of working with machinery, metal, and tools. To Lieutenant Hayes's eye, Frank looked exactly like someone who should have retired years ago, slow, using outdated methods, and unable to keep pace with modern maintenance procedures and technology. Hayes picked up a work order form and waved it accusingly at Frank. This M1 Abrams tank was supposed to have its transmission serviced 3 days ago. It's still sitting in Bay 7, incomplete, holding up training schedules and affecting battalion readiness. I've watched you work, and you're using techniques from decades ago. You don't understand modern hydraulic systems. You're too slow, too outdated, and frankly too old to be working on equipment this sophisticated. I want you gone by the end of the day. The accusation was delivered loudly enough that mechanics in 4 adjacent work bays could hear clearly, and the humiliation factor was rising rapidly. Several younger soldiers exchanged uncomfortable glances, and one staff sergeant who had worked at the motor pool for 6 years tried to interject. "Sir, maybe we should discuss this with the, I don't need input from the enlisted ranks, Staff Sergeant," Hayes interrupted sharply. "I'm the officer in charge of this motor pool. Personnel decisions are my responsibility, and I've decided this civilian contractor is not meeting standards. My decision is final." Frank slowly set down his torque wrench and wiped his hands on a shop rag that had absorbed decades of various oils and fluids. "Lieutenant, I understand you're frustrated about the timeline on that transmission job. But there's a reason it's taking longer than the manual suggests. That particular M1A2 has a known issue with the X1100-3B transmission that requires, I don't want explanations or excuses," Hayes cut him off, his voice growing louder with irritation. "I want results. Modern mechanics complete jobs on schedule. You're using outdated methods and taking 3 times longer than necessary. That's unacceptable in a combat-ready unit. You're relieved. Security will escort you off post once you've cleared out your personal tools." Before Frank could formulate a response that might salvage the situation, a voice called out from the motor pool office with the unmistakable authority of a senior non-commissioned officer who had just witnessed a catastrophic leadership failure. "Lieutenant Hayes, get to my office right now. Immediately." "That's not a request." The speaker was Command Sergeant Major Robert Johnson, 52 years old, the senior enlisted advisor for the 1st Cavalry Division and a man with 32 years of experience in armored units including multiple combat deployments. Johnson had been reviewing maintenance reports when he heard Hayes's raised voice and the commotion. He knew Frank Martinez personally, had worked with him for 15 years, and understood immediately that the young lieutenant had just made a career-threatening error that needed to be corrected before it caused irreparable damage. Johnson was not someone whose orders were questioned, and Hayes's confident expression finally cracked slightly as he realized the most senior enlisted person on the installation had just overheard his entire tirade and sounded profoundly displeased. Hayes walked toward the motor pool office with diminishing swagger, aware that every mechanic and soldier in the facility was now watching him and sensing that perhaps his dramatic firing order had been premature. Johnson waited until Hayes was inside the office before speaking, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of a senior NCO who was containing genuine anger through sheer force of professional discipline. "Do you have any idea who you just fired?" Hayes straightened defensively. "Sergeant Major, he's a civilian contractor who's not meeting performance standards. The transmission job is 3 days overdue, and he's using outdated methods." That man," Johnson interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade, "is Frank Martinez. He served as a tank driver with the 1st Cavalry Division in Korea in 1952 and 1953. He drove an M46 Patton tank through some of the most intense fighting of that war. After his Army service, he spent 53 years as a civilian master mechanic working on every armored vehicle the United States Army has fielded from the M48 to the M1 Abrams. He's worked at this motor pool for 28 years. He's forgotten more about tank maintenance than you've learned in your entire 3 months as a maintenance officer." Johnson pulled out a personnel file that was remarkably thick for a civilian contractor and began pulling out documents and photographs, spreading them across his desk where Hayes could see them clearly. The first document was Frank's Department of the Army civilian personnel record showing continuous service since 1971, 53 years of documented expertise. The second document was a commendation letter from a previous division commander recognizing Frank for identifying a critical design flaw in early M1 Abrams transmissions that had prevented multiple catastrophic failures. The third item was a photograph from the 1980s showing a younger Frank instructing a class of Army mechanics on M60 tank maintenance procedures. "Frank Martinez," Johnson continued, his voice growing harder with each sentence, "is not just a mechanic. He's a master craftsman who has trained literally hundreds of Army mechanics over 5 decades. That outdated method you criticized is actually a technique he developed in the 1990s for diagnosing transmission problems that the technical manual doesn't adequately address. That technique is now taught at the Army's Ordnance School because it's more effective than the standard procedure. Multiple mechanics have told me that Frank can diagnose problems by sound and feel that computerized diagnostic equipment misses completely." Johnson pulled up another document showing Frank's specific expertise certifications. He holds master-level certifications on every tracked vehicle system the Army currently operates. He's been the subject matter expert consultant for 3 different tank upgrade programs. Lockheed Martin, the company that builds the M1 Abrams, has him on retainer as a civilian consultant because his field experience with actual operational problems is invaluable for their engineering teams. General Dynamics calls him when they're designing new transmission systems because he understands how equipment actually performs under combat conditions versus how it performs in laboratory testing. Hayes's face had transitioned from defensive to pale as the magnitude of his error became clear. He looked at the documents showing decades of expertise and contributions, trying to reconcile his image of Frank as a slow old mechanic with the reality of a legendary expert whose knowledge was sought by defense contractors and senior military leadership. Johnson wasn't finished with his education. "Let me explain something to you about that transmission job you're so concerned about. The M1A2 SEP-V3 variant has a known issue with the X1100-3B transmission where the torque converter can develop microcracks that don't show up on standard diagnostic equipment. Frank identified that problem on the tank in Bay 7, a problem that would have resulted in catastrophic transmission failure during training exercises, potentially causing $1 million repair bill and possibly injuring the crew. The delay you're complaining about is Frank taking extra time to properly inspect components that the technical manual says don't need inspection, because his experience tells him they do need inspection on this particular variant." Johnson pulled up maintenance records showing Frank's work history. Over 28 years at this motor pool, Frank has maintained a perfect record. 0 accidents. 0 safety violations. Hundreds of complex repairs completed successfully. Multiple instances of identifying problems that prevented equipment failures. He saved the Army millions of dollars and prevented damage and identified safety issues before they became casualties. He turned his computer screen so Hayes could see inspection reports and commanders' comments spanning decades. Every battalion commander and division commander who has worked with Frank has praised his expertise. The current commanding general of 3 Corps specifically requested that Frank be retained past normal retirement age because his knowledge is irreplaceable. You don't have the authority to fire him, Lieutenant. That would require approval from the garrison commander, and I can guarantee you that request would be denied and your judgment would be questioned. Johnson pulled out another photograph, this one showing Frank standing beside a damaged M1 Abrams tank in Iraq in 2005. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, when Frank was 64 years old, he volunteered to deploy as a civilian contractor to support maintenance operations in combat. He spent 6 months in Iraq, often working under indirect fire, keeping tanks operational for combat missions. That's the kind of dedication you're dismissing as too slow and outdated. That man has more commitment to this division and this army than you've demonstrated in your entire 3 months of service. The weight of Johnson's words hung heavy in the small office. Hayes managed to find his voice, though it came out considerably less confident than before. Sergeant Major, I didn't know his background. I saw a mechanic who was taking longer than the manual specified and using techniques I didn't recognize. I thought I was enforcing standards and improving efficiency. You were enforcing standards you don't understand, Johnson corrected sharply, and instead of asking questions or seeking guidance from experienced NCOs who know this motor pool and its personnel, you jumped immediately to firing someone whose expertise you're not qualified to evaluate. The technical manual gives baseline times for repairs under ideal conditions. Real-world maintenance often takes longer because real problems are more complex than the manual anticipates. Frank takes longer because he does the job right, not just fast. Johnson gestured toward the motor pool where work had resumed but tension remained visible. Every mechanic out there, soldier and civilian, just watched you publicly humiliate and fire one of the most respected experts in this facility. You've damaged morale, undermined your own credibility, and demonstrated that you value speed over quality and rank over expertise. That's failed leadership, Lieutenant. He pulled up the organizational chart showing the motor pool's chain of command and civilian contractor management structure. For your education, you don't have unilateral authority to fire civilian contractors. That requires coordination with the Civilian Personnel Office, documentation of performance issues, progressive counseling, and approval from your commander. You can't just decide someone is fired because you're frustrated with a timeline. The fact that you thought you had that authority shows how little you understand about your actual responsibilities and limitations. Johnson softened slightly, recognizing that Hayes needed to learn from this rather than just be destroyed by it. You're not the first young officer to assume that rank means you know more than experienced enlisted soldiers or civilians. But you need to understand something fundamental: expertise doesn't correlate with rank or age in reverse. Frank Martinez has been maintaining tanks since before you were born. The techniques you called outdated are actually proven methods that have been refined through decades of application. When you see something you don't understand, your first response should be to ask questions and learn, not to criticize and fire people. Hayes was directed to return to the motor pool and personally apologize to Frank in front of the same audience that had witnessed the firing order. He walked back onto the floor with his confidence completely shattered, finding Frank at his workstation calmly continuing to work on the transmission despite the drama. The elderly mechanic was using a specialized tool to carefully inspect the torque converter, his weathered hands moving with the precise confidence that comes from having performed similar operations thousands of times. "Mr. Martinez," Hayes began, his voice barely steady, "I owe you a profound apology. I was completely wrong. I judged your work based on my limited understanding and inexperience. I didn't recognize your expertise, and I disrespected you publicly. I'm sorry." Frank set down his tools and looked at Hayes with eyes that had seen young officers make similar mistakes for decades. "Lieutenant, you're young and new to maintenance operations. These systems are complex, and the technical manuals don't cover everything you'll encounter in real operations. What's important is that you learn from this experience. My methods might look different from what you learned in school, but they're based on decades of experience with how these machines actually behave under stress. He gestured to the partially disassembled transmission. This torque converter has microcracks that the diagnostic computer missed. See these stress patterns here? This is what 50 years of experience teaches you to recognize. If this tank had gone to the field without this inspection, the transmission would have failed catastrophically during operations, possibly causing injury and definitely causing extensive damage. Taking 3 extra days to do this inspection right will save months of downtime and hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs. Over the following weeks, Hayes requested to shadow Frank during complex maintenance operations, learning not just the mechanical procedures but the deeper understanding of how systems fail and how experience allows mechanics to identify problems that technology misses. He learned that Frank's slow pace was actually methodical thoroughness that prevented future problems. He learned that the outdated techniques were actually refined procedures that addressed real-world complications that didn't exist in textbook scenarios. And he learned humility, understanding that leadership meant recognizing and leveraging expertise wherever it existed, regardless of rank or age. The motor pool's other mechanics, initially angry at how Hayes had treated Frank, gradually warmed to the young lieutenant as they saw genuine efforts to learn and improve. Staff Sergeant Williams, a career mechanic with 12 years' experience, took Hayes aside one afternoon and shared his own perspective. "Sir, most of us learned our advanced skills from Frank. The Army taught us the basics, but Frank taught us how to really understand these machines. He can hear a problem in an engine that diagnostic equipment can't detect. He can feel through his tools what's happening inside a transmission. That's not something you can learn from a manual, it comes from decades of hands-on experience and genuine mastery of the craft." Several months later, when that M1A2 returned from field exercises with 0 mechanical issues despite intensive operations, the battalion commander specifically mentioned the quality of maintenance work in his training assessment. He called Hayes to his office and commended the motor pool's performance, noting that Frank Martinez had been specifically mentioned by tank commanders for his thorough pre-deployment inspections that had prevented multiple potential failures. The commander smiled knowingly. "I hear you've been learning from Frank, Lieutenant. That's smart. That man has forgotten more about tank maintenance than most mechanics will ever know. Keep learning from him while we still have him available." The incident became a teaching point in the division's junior officer professional development program, anonymized but preserved as a lesson about recognizing expertise, avoiding premature judgments, and understanding the limits of one's own knowledge. New lieutenants learned about the importance of consulting experienced NCOs and civilian experts before making personnel decisions, about the reality that technical manuals provide baselines but experience provides wisdom, and about the fact that the most valuable members of any organization often don't hold the highest ranks. Frank Martinez continued his work at the Fort Hood Motor Pool, and his weathered hands continued to maintain tanks with the same methodical expertise that had characterized his 53 years of service. Hayes learned to recognize that those oil-stained coveralls and slow, careful work pace represented mastery rather than inadequacy. And the motor pool's soldiers learned from watching their lieutenants' growth that true leadership meant having the courage to admit mistakes, the humility to learn from those with more experience, and the wisdom to recognize that expertise transcends rank and age. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments about a time when you learned to recognize expertise in unexpected places. Subscribe to Hidden Legends for more stories proving that true mastery is earned through decades of dedicated service.